Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we work, and in my case also live, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. To the best of my knowledge, that includes the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Quitlutton nations. So today, welcome to Travelogues. Thank you so much for coming. And it's nice that the weather held off. I was kind of worried that we might have snow. We have some fantastic speakers today. And we're very lucky that we had a few people come at the last moment and kind of save the day. As you might have noticed with the email that mentioned rumors of a mysterious speaker, which is actually Lizzie Dingo, who has agreed to come and join the talk today. She's a postdoc in the department. I met her today for the first time, so many thanks to you. Lizzie represents the physical side of geography, which should help balance things out a bit today. The second speaker will be our grad representative, Gravestock. Also extremely busy preparing for her qualifying exams, so much thanks to her for agreeing to come and prepare for this today. Which brings us to our first speaker, which is our faculty representative, cross-appointed with Geography and Urban Studies, Dr. Meg Holden. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks. Hi, I'm Meg, for those of you I haven't met. So I was told that the purpose of today's conversation is to talk about the story behind the story, so that's what I'm going to try and do. So this is me. I like this picture, which a student of mine took during a field trip that we did during the course, because it definitely shows the somewhat chaotic way in which I perceive learning about the city to take place. So what am I looking for in my research program generally? I think I want to know what cities should be shaped like and what they should operate like in order to be less wasteful, less hateful, more thoughtful, and more generative, both of development potential and ideas and actions. And I want to contribute to better habits of urbanism and urbanity. But if I try and ask myself more personally what I'm doing, I'm here trying to understand why I love cities so much, even though they often make me sick. And perhaps even one step further removed into the personal domain, I want to have a story to tell. And then another thing that I've noticed maybe more recently that is significant to the way I pursue research is that I am unwilling to relinquish a speculative stance, which actually does foreclose conversations with a lot of other social scientists who see research as being pretty fundamentally about the non-speculative, the demonstrative side of life, of facts and things that we know. And that the way that manifests in some of my projects, I'm taking a bit of a chronological approach since my arrival at SFU in late 2003. I have worked on projects like this. This was we started an urban observatory, which was a member of a UN Habitat-based network to establish a habit of monitoring sustainable development in cities. And we pulled together hundreds of citizens in order to come up with a set of indicators in different categories that made life meaningful here to them. We produced this report for the World Urban Forum, which took place in Vancouver in 2006. This is another piece of research that we produced in time for this forum. It was sort of an exciting time for urbanists in Vancouver because we were getting ready to try and host this big conversation about cities worldwide. Moving to another sort of piece chunk now, so that had its own trajectory. The Urban Observatory really no longer exists. It was something that couldn't sort of survive the post World Urban Forum scene in Vancouver, when the sort of thrill about urban policy and urban development subsided a bit. Another piece of work is that for the past decade I've been working, more than a decade actually, been working with the Vancouver Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization in BC, actually the largest one. They give out about $1 million a week in community philanthropic funds. And I've been working with them to try and develop a sense of how they can be engaged in research-based philanthropy. So as opposed to responsive philanthropy that just sort of takes people's bequests and their money and does what the people want, the donors want, that as an agency that also tries to have an opinion about what should happen in order to improve conditions in this Vancouver region, and then sometimes broader to BC as a whole. So we've been doing the vital signs reporting, which is really similar to what we did with the Vancouver Observatory in terms of reporting on indicators of, in this case, vitality, but a lot of similar themes to sustainable development. And that's led to a series of reports with the Vancouver Foundation, again, on what was kind of a surprising finding from the indicators work, which was that one of the things that people are most unhappy with in their lives in Vancouver is the lack of a sense of social connection. So this sort of sense that Vancouver is a lonely place to be, and that it's hard to make deep friendships and lasting connections. So the most recent report came out in 2017, and maybe getting to some of this, the way in which it's been challenging for me to engage with an organization like a community philanthropy that really doesn't have a particular sense of what research is that this is a picture of the cover from their big report in which they point out the challenge that 25% of the population in the Metro Vancouver region feels lonely more than they would like. I find this picture to be actually like a very upbeat, like she looks like she's having a pretty good time to me actually, and enjoying a beautiful day of solitude. So that's just one of the challenges. So it has been definitely a negotiation in trying to figure out how to engage non-research organizations and sometimes non-policy organizations in research. That work has led to a project that the Vancouver Foundation is involved in but not leading, with the City of Vancouver and their Healthy Cities initiative. We call it Hey Neighbor, and what we've been trying to do is insert a kind of a social infrastructure into rental buildings in the City of Vancouver in order to sort of create a possibility for neighborly behavior, really. So it involves a staff person from the City of Vancouver who is sort of a connector and a networker, and it involves seeking volunteers from each building that's involved in the pilot project to be what we call a resident animator, or someone who is willing and interested and has some time on their hands to engage their neighbors in social activities. And this has actually, and so we're part of we're doing an evaluation of this work now and looking at the difference that it makes if one of the buildings that we're looking at is an older building in the Collingwood neighborhood, another one is a new one in the new Canby corridor development. Very different populations of people, different sort of stress points in their lives and their abilities to connect. And then we're also trying to look at how we can turn this social connections project into a window for changing people's attitudes and behaviors, not just about neighborliness and about home and what it is, but also about things like emergency preparedness, their behaviors in relation to sustainability goals, health goals, and climate change response goals. Another piece of my research, which is perhaps less partnership-oriented, is a project I've been working on since 2012 really, and that's looking at what it means to try and develop standardized neighborhoods. So this is a model by Clarence Perry back in the 1950s, and you can kind of get a sense just from the model that the idea is that we can determine what a perfect neighborhood is, what it's shaped like, how big it is, how many people live there, what kinds of facilities and services need to be there, and that this is a sort of, it's and it's a continuation of a long, hundreds of years old tradition of trying to come up with the perfect spatial and technical dimensions, but with the added novelty now of the effort to globally standardize these neighborhoods and to certify them as sustainable. And so I've been looking internationally at what that actually means in terms of what these projects and neighborhoods end up looking like, what kinds of policies go into creating them, what they feel like to live in them, what kinds of actions and behavior changes they preclude and allow. I started out with a comparative project in Southeast Falls Creek in the Olympic Village in Vancouver with the Melbourne Docklands project, which is similar to, but not exactly the same as the Southeast Falls Creek development. Also a sort of a new industrial redevelopment project as a post-industrial, livable, full service kind of place. But this has taken me to other parts of the world as well. A lot of the projects I've been looking at in this wider study have been European examples, although I do have colleagues who have been sharing their insights about how these phenomena do work out in Asia and Latin America differently. And here's an example from Copenhagen, in which they're developing one of the largest development projects in Europe right now, which is this Nordhavn project, the Northern Harbor. And in case you can't tell from this imagery, it's actually they're actually creating the land and then building the neighborhood on the land. So the land comes from a new subway, the tunneling for a new subway system, a new subway line in Copenhagen. And actually, the sort of the irony is that so it's toxic for one thing. They're filling in the North Sea and then building a model sustainable, and it's more than a neighborhood, it's a district of 40,000 people into it. And the irony is that the idea that this neighborhood has to be built to a certain sort of upper class standard by Copenhagen standards is justified by the fact that it has to pay for the subway, which serves the entire city, including, of course, the middle and the lower classes. So there's an interesting sort of set of new kinds of political justifications for these sustainable developments that I find very fascinating. Right now, I'm working on digesting the results of a research stay spent in Paris looking at the specifically French case of how sustainable neighborhoods are conceived and modeled and built and certified based on a uniquely French framework called ecoquartier, and comparing one particular ecoquartier in the sort of the outer neighborhood, the outer district of Paris, with a district in Victoria that probably some of you know, called Dockside Green. And I don't know if the pictures don't necessarily make this come out, but there are many sort of formalistic similarities. There's a cafe, a main square, a sort of a medium density kind of building rising above, and this is very similar hub building to Dockside Green. And that's just to give you a sense of how some of the standardization plays out in terms of both the built form, but then also an expectation about how we use the space and what it means for the city to use the space in that way. So I'm super excited about that project. Another just sort of a couple of like rapid fire things of other things that have gone into my sort of research basket. I have worked with the Home Builders Association, and that was quite an interesting project that lasted for a few years. And really it broke down because of we could agree on the objective of the project, which was to better understand the development approvals process in Vancouver up to a certain point. And then when the point came that the research actually showed that the cost of the housing had nothing to do with the efficiency of the development approvals process, the partnership really broke apart quickly. So that's been an interesting lesson in partnership-based research. Other research that I've been involved in has looked at people's reaction to infill development, so kind of missing middle or hidden density. It's a non-tower based densification that goes into typically single-family homes, and we're going to be seeing that both the resistance to it and the push for it increasingly in the next 30 years in the region. Part of this is looking at public participation processes, how those expectations for participation have really ratcheted up over the past decade or so, and how people have become more and more sophisticated at engaging with them. So here's a comparative look at the Citizens Assembly that took place a few years ago in the Commercial Drive neighborhood, and really a citizen group that was formed in Delta in order to make the case explicitly to remove this piece of property from the agricultural land reserve in order to build what they consider to be a sustainable community on it. I look at this from mostly a kind of a yin perspective, not of the hard politics dimensions, but of the social learning dimensions. And I see this as happening at a variety of different levels. So single loop learning, being just doing things properly, just sort of following the rules. Double loop learning, asking yourself whether the rules are well made and well founded and worth following. And triple loop learning, being actually questioning the way in which the rules have been conceived and designed. And that's building from learning theory as well as the philosophy of pragmatism. So where does all this sort of just a flyby, but where does all this come from? I've been quite inspired by this individual, and I wanted to just read you a little piece about how I kind of came to terms with the origins of my research in this whole realm back in the early 90s. So this is the preface from my book, my 2017 book. In April 1991, I filed in line to board a yellow school bus to a rival high school's gymnasium for a county-wide Earth Day event. The event had been planned to engage me and my fellow teenagers on the 20-year anniversary of Earth Day and included lots of milling about, awkward giggling and oogling, information booths and stickers, some political speeches, and Dr. David Suzuki. I remember that attendance was optional, and at that time, in my so far suburban life, playing hooky with friends was a much more popular thing to do than attending planned rallies. To be truthful, doing that which my friends were doing was the default decision. This time, though, I got on the bus, although I don't recall any of my friends opting to go. Tony was there, my school's star basketball player and my first crush. He was unique in my mind, not for his fame, but because he told me in one of our rare conversations that his favorite subject was geography. Conditioned by peer pressure, I didn't understand at that time how the subject of geography could in any way achieve such status in the mind of a status-concerned kid. Anyway, we may have said hi, but we didn't talk at that Earth Day rally. The event was packed with students who I guess had also overcome their self-consciousness about feeling uncool for caring about Earth Day when they could be enjoying time away from school, or maybe they were more socially advanced than I was. I don't remember talking to any of my fellow students. It's possible I simply couldn't, because I do remember being struck speechless by the crisis, the challenge, and the marching orders handed down to me that day, particularly by Suzuki. He unceremoniously and straightforwardly pulled the cord on the blinders in front of my blue eyes about the condition of the world, the position of my country in it, the work that lay before the willing, and the implications of not getting personally involved deeply, utterly, and with gusto. Up until this time, I didn't think anything could be more moving than a Pink Floyd song. I was already a self-proclaimed environmentalist, contributing money earned from babysitting to both Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund. But all things considered, this was mostly about the bumper stickers these organizations sent me back, which I used to decorate my school binders. Hearing Suzuki's presentation on the perils of the planet sent me over the deep end. Whales and baby seals were being killed, rainforests destroyed, toxic chemicals released from my paper and most of the products I used, and the atmosphere was being seriously messed with. All this I already knew. But he convinced me that I was implicated, my family was implicated, and in my ignorance of this, I had already been shirking my responsibility while the dire situation deteriorated. I went home and I did what Suzuki said to do. I wrote signs to my parents and posted them on my bedroom door, on the refrigerator, and even on their bathroom mirror. Following his careful instructions, the sign said, "Every 6 seconds, 133,000 species are going extinct. And we have 10 years to change the world. And would you ignore your daughter if she told you you had cancer?" For the record, this initiation to home-based direct action on my part had exactly zero impact. Not one conversation or changed idea or diverted or reallocated shopping dollar, or altered habit resulted in my household, present writer excluded. David Suzuki would not be proud of me, I thought, and I decided not to take activist ideas any further. I obviously wasn't very good at it, and if Suzuki ever found out, I would be humiliated. I was pretty shy, besides. I did have a knack for formal learning, however, and so this was an obvious place to invest my energy for what became, the following year at Rio, the quest for sustainable development. Now, equipped with the confidence of 20 more years of thinking about sustainable development, the credibility of a PhD, and experience as an urban researcher engaged with policy, activism, and organizations in a host of cities, this book demonstrates how I am coming to terms with the sordid results of my early attempts at activism and making some ginger steps back out to the street with my ideas. My mother's home, of course, remains the final frontier. I wanted to just mention also that these, as I mentioned a bit briefly in that preface, that these ideas do have geographical beginnings for me. And the way in which I've approached sort of the philosophical arm of my research really goes back to a second year biogeography course that I took as an undergrad at UVic. The syllabus of this course directed us to read 2 books side by side, and that seemed like a pretty good responsibility for me to take on at that time. And the professor kind of went on, assigned those books, and then went on about his curriculum, David Duffus. And it was as if he'd placed a ticking clock on his head. It was quite distracting as a student. The clock was timing students' reaction to these 2 books, and we were all primed to expect a particular kind of reaction. The prof took on the aura of Rumpelstiltskin, waiting for the consequences of the mischief he had brought to sink into our young heads. The 2 books were Daniel Botkin's Discordant Harmonies, A New Ecology for the 21st Century, and David Ehrenfeld's 1978, The Arrogance of Humanism. Both were written by ecologists for non-scientists, both were sounding an alarm of ecological crisis, of global proportions, and both offered heretical treatments of biological and ecological science. In Botkin's case, he took issue with the climax theory of ecology, that nature left alone without human disturbance tends toward a singular climax state, theoretically sustainable for all time. This theory came, in Botkin's view, from a misguided human metaphor and resulted in categorically bad prescriptions for ecology and wildlife by professionals expecting ecosystems to mimic processes that they had no business with. For Ehrenfeld, the focus was the arrogance of permitting humanism to enter into one's scientific efforts, resulting in the contamination of the pure curiosity and thirst for knowledge, core to the scientific model, with the political and social hubris that humans can solve any problem and overcome any difficulty given time and resources enough. And so my geography prof sniggered away at us, aspiring professional environmentalists, feeling himself to be usefully disabusing us of our sense of progress along a clear path towards securing a future in which we could apply our diligently obtained university skills to saving the world. And as we all finished reading the 2 books, we did indeed start to rub our eyes and gaze around at one another, compromised and shamed, suspicious of one's dreadlocks, another's hemp notebook, another's button-down shirt. What side were we all on? Did this all have to mean that we were no longer environmentalists or no longer professionals, or on the cusp of denying at least one of these objectives? And this was my introduction to the kind of the post-humanist stance. I realized that the intent, now looking back, was that he intended us to come to the conclusion that one of these ways of knowing, either the humanist or the post-humanist approach, was more real than the other one. And in fact, most of my explorations in my urban and my geographical research programs have really been attempts to sort of negotiate between these 2 views without being willing to take a stand that one is right and the other one is wrong. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. already
talking. I think if that's your suggestion, you should do it.
I think it was a question.
Well, now that I'm on the hook. Yeah, sort of Meg, sort of what I wanted to ask, when you talk about sustainable neighborhoods, sort of sustainability, does it include mostly, sort of in your definition, is it material flows or resource use waste, or does it also have a social sort of dimension in terms of community space sort of coming together? So when you talk about sort of these sustainable neighborhoods, is it just sort of the environmental side, or is there a social component?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that if you look at the ways in which the standards and the certification systems have been developed, they've come from the material side of things. They've come from building science particularly, and then a little bit from urban planning, which isn't even really a science, but ideas about urban design, which can be technical ideas. But the thing is that they have been justified and framed as offering a full set of social opportunities and livability benefits as well, without any corresponding research or any corresponding sort of assurances for how this might play out in different ways on the ground for people.
I had a question about, I guess it's about David Suzuki, but not really. So I thought it was interesting what you were saying a bit earlier before you go into Suzuki about your approach to thinking about knowledge and learning and the various ways you do that, and you showed some of your projects where clearly there's an attempt through engagement and through bringing people in and doing things to enhance capacities, enhance knowledge and so on, like you were talking about the Hey Neighbour programme, for example, and getting residents involved as well as the city person. And then you turn to the big picture in the story about Suzuki. And his, or at least the model of teaching and the model of knowledge creation and maybe enthusiasm building with him is more of a sort of top-down senior person telling you how he thinks about the world and what he thinks you should do about it. And I just wonder if you could talk about those, like how do those different versions of sort of teaching and learning work?
Yeah, I understand the question. I don't really have an answer for you, other than to say I think that's a little bit unfair towards Suzuki, because I don't think that that's actually the way, he doesn't. It's true that he went all the way across Canada telling high school students to put stickers on the doors. And so perhaps he took liberty with youth, but I think you have to, I mean, if you look at like what his children have done in the world, that he has also taken a capacity building kind of approach. So I don't think that's fair, but still your question is still fair. You know, I guess this is where my sort of my speculative stance comes into play, because I have to believe that there is possibilities within a sort of a bottom-up capacity building approach, even though when I try and look objectively at the way change typically happens in cities, it happens because of people empowerment and decisions. So I hope, but realistically, I can't say that that's actually the way that I perceive change is happening.
But often people in power make decisions because they see the writing on the wall, or they get enough pressure from the ground
So
up.
maybe, so hopefully it's not a dichotomous thing. Yeah.
Okay, I'll get started. My name is Gravestock. I'm a PhD student in geography. My research examines how clothes are consumed, disposed of, and produced through specific place-based relationships between consumers and workers in Metro Vancouver. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk about my master's research and some of the challenges that I came across while doing my field research. And I'm going to first talk about my research, then I'll talk about the challenges, and then I'm going to describe my current research and how it relates to my master's project. Feel free to jump in at any point and ask me questions. So first I'm going to talk about how I became interested in my topic. So yeah, how did I become interested in researching clothing consumption? As a teenager, clothing became an important way for me to distinguish myself as belonging to a subculture. I was an angsty alternative teen who defined myself through clothing and my musical preferences, which were punk and grunge. Clothing became a means of identity formation. As a teen, most of my clothes were purchased at Value Village. I grew up in Richmond, and at the time there were no thrift stores in Richmond. So my mom would drive me and my girlfriends out to Vancouver to go to the Value Village on Victoria Drive. This was one of my favorite activities. I loved searching through the racks of clothing to find one or two weird and unique pieces. I often think that I inherited this trait from my mom, who is an avid thrifter and recycler. I also spent a lot of time at malls with my grandma, who just loved browsing. As a child and as a teen, she would take me and my sister shopping every weekend. So that obviously influenced my research interests in clothing consumption. And my sister also, interestingly, works for a major clothing brand. Since being a teen, I've always purchased a large proportion of my clothes from thrift stores, mostly due to the cost and the ability to find unique items. Something I had never considered before until the last semester of my undergrad, which I did in political science, and also I did a minor in labor studies. I'd never thought of what happens to unsold clothing donations at thrift stores. This question, along with the opportunity to work with Dr. Malaria Clark at UVic, a feminist political economist who studies work and fast fashion, totally altered my academic trajectory. One of the major concepts for my research is fast fashion. This term is important because it significantly changed how fashion has been consumed and produced. In contrast to fashion product lifestyles, which historically were based just on 2 seasons, the shorter production life cycle of fast fashion means that retailers can respond to changing consumer trends much more quickly. This means that an item can be designed and produced and in a retail store in just 2 weeks now, where before this process would take months. Examples of fast fashion retailers include Zara, H&M, and Forever 21. An important aspect of fast fashion is that it cannot exist without the overproduction and overconsumption of cheap disposable clothing. So now I'm just going to briefly describe my MA research. The objective of my master's thesis was to better understand the relationship between fast fashion, clothing consumption and disposal patterns, and the global trade in secondhand clothing donations by examining what motivates individuals to donate clothing to thrift stores and how thrift stores are linked to the international trade in secondhand clothing. My literature review revealed that there is a gap in scholarship on the secondhand clothing industry. This research has focused on the US and UK and has found that a large proportion of donated secondhand clothing is commercially exported to the global south, primarily to sub-Saharan Africa. Limited research has been carried out on textile recycling in Canada, and specifically on how Canadians consume and dispose of textiles. Thrift stores promote the message that secondhand clothing donations do good when they solicit donations from individuals. In my thesis, I argue that this narrative of doing good overemphasizes the social and economic value of donated clothing, and it conceals the negative aspects of overconsumption and the problems associated with the commercial export of secondhand clothing. For instance, the export of donated clothing to the global south displaces local clothing industries, and also a large proportion of these clothes end up in landfills in global south countries, as it's actually not resaleable in these markets. So there was 4 primary research questions that I tried to address in my project. The first one was what happens to secondhand clothing donations once they reach thrift stores? How do thrift stores dispose of unsold clothing donations? What motivates individuals to donate clothing to thrift stores? Are they aware of what happens to unsold secondhand clothing? And the last question, what is the link between thrift stores in Canada and international buyers who bundle and sell clothes to buyers in Africa? For my research design, I interviewed 30 individuals who donate excess clothes and employees who work at thrift stores that receive, sell, and dispose of donated clothes. I used a case study approach. My geographic case study was Victoria, BC, and my selected stores were 3 nonprofits thrift stores, which remain anonymous in my study, and Value Village, a for-profit thrift store. I've labeled the thrift stores, thrift store A, B, and C, and then Value Village. I just kept the name. I was interested in connecting individuals and households also to my research in order to learn more about their consumption and disposal patterns and individuals' general knowledge about the secondhand clothing industry. My fieldwork was carried out from mid-May to mid-August in 2017. Now I'm just going to describe some of the key findings from my research. The thrift stores that I studied received large quantities of clothing donations, more than they can sell. Approximately 70% of clothing donations are not sold in the thrift stores. Donors in my study tend to be females who are 50 or older and who selected their donation location for altruistic reasons. Only 3 participants in my study were aware of what actually happens to unsold clothing donations in thrift stores in Victoria. Participants who purchased more new clothing per year tended to donate clothing more often. The majority of participants purchased new clothing from fast fashion retailers. A number of participants attributed the value of doing good to donating clothes. And lastly, unsold clothing donations at Thrift Store B and Value Village, I found, were both commercially exported primarily to African countries. And so now I'm going to talk about some of the challenges I faced conducting field work. I'm going to focus on the interviews and observations I collected at thrift stores. In order to persuade thrift stores to agree to participate in my research project, I decided to trade volunteer hours for participation in my study. This was mutually beneficial as it provided me with the opportunity to spend more time in the stores collecting observational data. The first thrift store I conducted research at was Thrift Store A. This was an eye-opening experience. It hadn't occurred to me that volunteering in a thrift store could be considered a dirty or dangerous job. I interviewed the primary clothing sorter, and I worked with her for 2 days sorting clothes. The first step to sorting the secondhand clothing was to grab a bag from the back room, bring it to the sorting room, and place it out on the sorting table. The bags are standard black garbage bags, and they were piled floor-to-ceiling high in the back room. The bags are slowly torn open from the side. I was warned not to stick my hands into the bags and to be careful when opening each one. Wearing gloves was highly recommended. In the past, workers had found needles, blood, broken glass, and wet, dirty laundry inside the donation bags. A surprising observation was that a large proportion of clothes that were donated were in bad condition. A lot of the items that I sorted had not been washed first, smelled bad, and were covered in animal hair. The amount of clothes that Thrift Store A received that are dirty seemed to be an ongoing problem that was commented on by the workers. Thrift Store A does not wash or disinfect any of the clothes. If they are dirty or stained, they are sent for recycling. None of the other stores in my study also washed or disinfected their clothes. On my third shift at Thrift Store A, I was working with a different clothing sorter who seemed unhappy or annoyed that I was there. In response, I was tasked with the job that no one else wanted, sorting bags of underwear. I'm not going to go into detail here, but it was a very unpleasant experience. Okay, so how do you get participants to reveal information that might make their organization look bad? This was the biggest challenge I faced while conducting my fieldwork at thrift stores, and something I often reflect on. Early on in my research, it became apparent that staff members and managers were unwilling to openly discuss what happens to unsold clothing donations. Perhaps if I was more extroverted, or if I had more experience conducting qualitative research, I could have found out more. But one of the problems I faced was just trying to get a hold of someone at Value Village to interview. Initially, I had tried contacting the Value Village store in Victoria to schedule an interview with the manager, but the manager informed me that I would have to contact the director of corporate communications at Value Village for permission to interview staff members. For 4 months, I tried to contact this person. I called many times, I left voicemails, I emailed. She never returned any of my calls or emails. Eventually, after talking to a number of my friends about my problem here, a friend of a friend who used to work for Value Village put me in contact with someone they knew who had previously been a manager at the Victoria location. And she's now a manager at a different Value Village, and she agreed to talk to me over the phone. On a similar note, I was in an email conversation with someone for months from Thrift Store B before they agreed to participate in my research. At Thrift Store C, the manager declined to answer a number of questions. Any question about the store's organizational structure seemed to be off limits. I had previously spoken to him on the phone about the interview and was not expecting this when I arrived for the interview. I had to quickly change my approach. I decided to act very naive and non-threatening and to try and continue our conversation for as long as possible. This seemed to work. The longer our conversation went on for, the more information he revealed that he had initially declined. I used a similar approach with the manager at Value Village, who seemed uneasy talking to me on the phone. My main objective was to keep her on the phone for as long as possible. This also seemed to work as we talked for over an hour. I asked her if she knew the names of countries and companies where Value Village ships unsold clothing to, and she responded, quote, "I don't know exactly, and I can't tell you who the specific companies that items are sold to. These are trade secrets," unquote. The manager that I spoke with stated that approximately 1% of clothing donations end up in landfills, probably even less. When I asked her what types of clothes are disposed of in garbage, she responded, quote, "If there's a threat of infestation, something Value Village doesn't like us to talk about. If there's any kind of possibility of an infestation, then we might throw out a large amount of clothes. Clothes are not washed by Value Village. If you look at the amount of clothing that we receive, it's just not feasible. We don't put our clothing out if it doesn't seem washed. We recommend that our customers wash items when they take them home," unquote. Another issue I came across with my research was dealing with conflicting information. My fieldwork at 4 thrift stores illustrates how a large proportion of donated clothes are not sold in these thrift stores. But attempting to document this amount was really challenging, and a number of participants provided me with contradictory information. I had to rely on my own observations and on a close analysis of the power relations in each working environment. Attempting to map what happens to unsold clothing donations also became a major stumbling block. At Thrift Store B and Value Village, I discovered that unsellable clothing donations are commercially exported to Africa. Unfortunately, at Thrift Store A and Thrift Store C, I was not able to trace what happens to unsellable clothing donations. At Thrift Store A, unsellable clothing donations are sold by the pound to a local charity, but the manager would not tell me the name of the charity and stated that it was confidential. The secrecy surrounding the secondhand clothing industry is linked to the tension between the business models that thrift stores and non-profit organizations engage in versus the models they present to the public. For example, an interesting outcome of my research was that I inspired one of the thrift stores to learn more about their role in the global trade of secondhand clothing. The thrift store requested a follow-up interview with me in which previously made statements and statistical information, which I believed to be accurate, were redacted. In my opinion, this information was redacted because of the tension between the operational model that the thrift store engages and the model that is presented to the public. I believe that by learning more about what happens to the unsold clothing donations in their store, the ethical narrative that the organization portrays to the public was ruptured. For example, specifics about how the organization disposes of unsellable clothing donations and the amount that the organization receives per pound for unsellable textiles was redacted. By the end of my fieldwork, I started to feel like an investigative reporter. In retrospect, I think I conducted way too many interviews for a master's thesis. At an early stage of developing my project, I became very concerned about making sure that my sample size was of significance. So I decided to conduct 30 interviews with individuals who donate clothes. 8 were in-person interviews and 14 were over the phone. The interviews lasted from anywhere from 5 minutes to 45 minutes. The average interview was about 15 minutes. Data collection included note-taking and audio recording. I then transcribed the audio recordings. Aside from these 30 interviews with individuals who donate clothing, I also conducted 7 interviews with individuals who work at thrift stores. Once I finished collecting my data, I had the enormous task of trying to interpret all this data. Aside from a few structured interviews I had conducted during my undergrad, I had never embarked on such an extensive qualitative research project before, and I had no idea how to interpret this data. My first instinct was to enter all the data into Excel and print it out so I could visually see what was happening. This was not helpful and made the whole process even more stressful, as I had many sheets of paper and I taped them all together and rolled them out onto a big table. It took me weeks to figure out how to interpret all this data. I went back to the key scholars that I had read on methods, John Cresswell and Charlene Nagy Hesse-Biber. I learned that Hesse-Biber had created a qualitative research program to analyze data called hyper-research. I learned how to use this program by watching YouTube videos and reading lots of blogs about this program. And I learned how to code and interpret my data based on themes and categories. So to conclude, I'm just going to talk about my current project and how it relates to my master's thesis. So my current project examines the consumption of new clothing. The objective of the project is to analyze how clothes are consumed, disposed of, and produced through specific place-based relationships between consumers and workers in Metro Vancouver. My main research questions are, what is the relationship between fast fashion, precarity, and urban change? How do geographies of fashion brands and branding influence lifestyles and social identities? How do modes of gendered embodiment influence the labor process and consumption in fashion stores? There's limited research on work and workers in spaces of consumption, and specifically on how clothing is consumed and disposed of in Canada. This research will contribute a critical understanding of the impacts of fashion consumption on individuals, communities, and urban space. A case study approach will be used to investigate 3 different types of fashion retailers: fast fashion, boutiques, and luxury fashion stores. The difference between the 3 types of retailers can be viewed in terms of class, identity, and lifestyle. Qualitative interviews will be conducted with individuals who purchase new clothing, as well as employees, managers, and owners at clothing stores in Vancouver. Quantitative data from the census will be used to examine income polarization in neighborhood change in Vancouver. And data from the Labor Force Survey and General Social Survey will be used to document rising precariousness. My supervisor is Dr. Kendra Strauss, and my committee members are Dr. Eugene McCann and Dr. Paul Kingsbury. As I'm currently studying for my qualifying exams, I have not completed my research proposal yet, and that's just a brief description of my project.
Great, thank you so much for the presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Questions?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking, you said there's not that much research on this at all, right?
Yeah.
So, like, not really any other cases of other cities that you would have compared, would have been able to compare to?
Yeah, in terms of secondhand clothing, there is very limited research. Yeah, so there's some research in Canada about how consumers, their motives for donating clothing and behaviors, but it's mostly from a marketing perspective, but there actually hasn't been an extensive study or any study about what happens to secondhand clothing once they leave their stores in Canada. Recently, though, the topic is becoming really popular, and there's a lot of like newspaper articles about it, and CBC has run a bunch of articles about the problems with this industry.
Yeah. I was thinking about the social geography of Victoria and how donations come, like, thrift stores, and I was
Yeah.
thinking about like how there's a lot of seniors that live in Victoria, and I'm wondering about like how do donations like is it just people of their own volition, or is there a lot of stuff that comes in, you know, because kids will come and empty out their parents' houses into like thrift stores, and is that a problem as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of clothing. Yeah, the majority of people who were donating clothing were females who were 50 or older. But they also get a lot of clothing at the end of the school year in the summertime when students were leaving UVic. And a lot of clothing is donated like in person to the thrift stores. And then also there's charities that drive around in trucks and pick up clothes like Big Brother from people's houses. And there's also a lot of donation bins all over the city, and same with Vancouver too.
I think there was another question. Good question. It was just about the donation bins, actually, and I was wondering if the terrible deaths related to those donation bins, if that's going to have any bearing on the sense that donating clothes is a good thing to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There was just another death recently with someone getting stuck in the bin. Yeah, it's really awful. And
also, I guess what that says about the local underground market for selling clothes.
And the issue is that it's actually a really profitable industry. And a lot of the donation bins are actually operating falsely as charities. Like they've used charity logos and they just make it seem like they're a charity, but they're actually for profit. So a lot of people think they're donating clothing and that they're doing good, that they're helping people, they're helping charities, and they're helping the community by donating this clothing that has economic value, when in fact it's just a for-profit company that is then selling those clothing to a commercial textile recycler that then is getting dumped into global south countries.
Any other questions?
Katie, did you share your findings with the thrift store?
No.
Thrift stores? No,
No.
you didn't. Okay, they didn't ask.
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah. They have my contact information, and I did say I was willing to share it with
We
them.
didn't follow up.
No, they didn't follow up.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation.
So this is going to be a little bit different from the last couple of presentations. So I only got asked by John on Tuesday afternoon if I could step in and do a presentation. And I'm not actually on the mailing list, I think, in the department, so I didn't even know these things existed. So I thought rather than filling it all with science, I thought I'd give you more of an overview of my journey into academia and some of the struggles that I've faced, specifically related to the discipline, and also barriers that I've had to overcome, which relates more properly to mental health. So none of you probably know me in here, apart from a couple of you. I'm a fairly new postdoc. I'm working with Jeremy Van Dizzy, started in September. But my background is as a fluvial and tectonic geomorphologist, which I'll just briefly go over what that actually is. And I finished a PhD last summer at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. Before that, did a master's and undergraduate at Durham University, also in the UK, so I'm very much a woman in science. So what do I do? What is a fluvial geomorphologist? According to my website, what I'm interested in is how sediment is generated inside mountain ranges and how it's then transported by rivers and exported out onto big floodplains. All of my PhD research has actually been in the Himalayas, so both the Indian and the Nepalese Himalayas, and more specifically looking at the rivers as they come out of the Himalayas and into the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So here's some pictures of me doing some science, looking quite cool, I think. So a lot of my work is actually taking physical measurements of sediment in rivers as they flow out mountains, giving information on fluid dynamics, Most of it is digging rocks, and then I also dabble in a bit of glaciology from time to time. So in my head, this is what I do. In reality, this is actually what I do. A lot of my work is remote sensing based. I do a lot of landscape analysis of mountain ranges, so this is the Andes. So looking at different landscape metrics, topography, and looking at how subsurface processes interact with surface processes. I've also done a reasonable amount of geochemical work, so looking at isotopes in river sediment. And then more recently I've been involved in more hazard-related research. So this is where being a geographer is kind of cool, because you do start to interact with social science as well. So earlier last year I was working on some projects in the Philippines, looking at how rivers migrate and what kind of hazards that presents. So a lot of remote sensing work. And part of me coming to SFU is to work with some of the experimental facilities that exist within the river dynamics group. So yeah, that's what I do. How did I get here? So I grew up in a very rural setting down in the very southwest of England, in Devon, on a farm. I spent most of my childhood just outside. This is actually fairly typical. I used to walk to school through fields that look something like this. And I think part of the reason that I research what I do is from that background. I grew up in the outdoors. I spend so much of my time in the outdoors, and I love it. But one of the things you don't really get in that part of the world are big mountains like you are blessed with in Canada. So this is the highest point in the southwest. It's at like 600 meters above sea level. But I still have great appreciation of it. And as I went through school, I've always been very interested in science. And I got to that point of, well, I'm going to go to university, what am I going to do? Before I went, I was lucky enough to go to the Yukon Territory. And it was there I saw my first real big mountains, and that blew my mind. These landscapes, to me, are living entities. When you can see sediment sliding off down the hill slopes, you see rivers transporting huge slurries of sediment out into other places and getting reworked, that for me is what blew my mind. And I was like, damn, this is what I want to study at university. So, I got into Durham and did an undergrad in natural sciences. So I started off doing geology, predominantly actually, and then realised that sucked. And started picking up a lot more physical and a little bit of human geography. In the last part, I finally got to go out on a field trip to the Alps and did a little work looking at subglacial hydrology. And I was like, wow, this is what I want to be. I want to be a glaciologist. I can go to the mountains with glaciers, and that would be great. And then I got more involved in courses and realised actually it's whole landscapes that are what I'm interested in, and that's going to let me go to these cool places. So at this point, it's probably worth pointing out that I didn't actually know anybody with a PhD. I didn't really know that you could do this as a job. So I chatted with an advisor, and he was like, hey, I've got a master's, I'll fund you to come out to the Himalayas. How does that sound? I was like, great, this sounds perfect. What he didn't actually point out was that it wasn't in the Himalayas, it was in the region downstream. And it looked something like this. Big rivers, sure, no topography, and it's a pretty challenging place to work. The temperatures are often very extreme. So during the monsoon, you'll be going out there, it's maybe 40 to 45 degrees, 100% humidity, and culturally, a massive change from that farm back in the West Country. And that's something that I really struggle with. I can't remember what's on the next slide, actually. Okay. So in the UK, a master's typically only lasts a year. The last 3 months of that, my advisor was on sabbatical, so I didn't actually see him at all. I struggled through, I got it submitted, and I got to the end of it, and I decided, that's me. Academia is not for me. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. And at the time, that felt like the right decision. I came out of my undergrad during the height of the economic recession, So getting a kind of a graduate job was very difficult. Oh, I meant to show this. This is just a figure to show you some of those working conditions out there. So we're trying to get some samples of the river from the bridge using a rope and some sampling stuff. If I go out onto a bridge, my hair colour and eye colour draws a crowd. So I am in there somewhere, but a crowd of maybe 100 or 200 people would quite regularly appear. And people would try and pull the equipment from you. They'd pull your hair, which is one of the stranger ones. Talk to you, and just stare at you. And as you walk along the bridge, everyone's just walking with you and staring. And I found that incredibly intimidating. I was like, this is a terrible idea. What am I doing? Anyway, so I had my sights set on a big city. This is it. I was going to go and get a graduate job. I got a position in an engineering company as a geomorphologist. I was like, great, I'm sorted. I can pay off my student debts. In reality, this is where I actually ended up. This is a very industrial town in northern England called Warrington, which is very well known for its train lines and chemical plants. It wasn't quite what I had in mind. Also, commonly or repeatedly voted the town in the UK with the lowest quality of life. And my job, I ended up doing a lot of work working in kind of urban planning, so looking at culverts, a bit of river restoration, some water quality. And after a couple of years, I sort of thought to myself, I really liked research and I really liked the challenges that it proposed to me. Why am I doing what I'm doing? So with that in mind, I decided I was going to go back into academia and apply for a PhD. So I chatted to some people at Edinburgh and said, I don't want to work in the Himalayas, I had a really crap time there, I'll go anywhere else. And they strongly encouraged me to apply for a PhD working in the Himalayas. So I did. And yeah, I had a very different kind of experience this time. This is a picture of one of my favourite rivers in Nepal. It's called the Manamchikola. And there was a really big earthquake in Nepal in 2015, the Gorkha earthquake, which you may or may not know of. And it generated a lot of landsliding, which impacted how sediment was being transported in a lot of these river systems. So what you kind of get is a pulse of sediment that gets released into the landscape, and these rivers rework that sediment. In some cases, that sediment can kind of clog a channel. So when you get these big monsoonal flows that come through in the summer, you get a very different type of flood risk. And it was actually going to landscapes like that, where you see these hazards develop, that I got really excited. It's one of the really nice things I like about geography, is that we can actually start to think about, well, how do we use our knowledge on physical processes in a more applied fashion? This is a landslide from 4 or 5 years ago called the Jura landslide. This is in the Botakosi Valley in Nepal. And this is a really phenomenal valley. I remember driving up it the first time. It was the first time I really thought this landscape is alive. If you stand there and close your eyes, you can just hear rocks falling in. You can hear landslides going off. You can hear sediment rumbling around in the rivers. And it's an amazing place. But with these kind of big landslide events, what you can see here is that landslide has effectively dammed that valley. So the river's been able to cut through it over time, but upstream of here, what you get is a big impoundment, basically. You have this lake that is dammed by this landslide. Working in these kind of conditions is very challenging. You turn up to your accommodation a month after the big earthquake, and you find your accommodation is largely like this. I thought I could go into some of the tales of specifically fieldwork details I've had where I've been in some quite interesting situations, but I decided not to. I didn't know if I'd get insurance for any more fieldwork. But yeah, this is when we really start to see this interaction between the environment and people. So this is that lake upstream of that landslide. And what you've got here are the roofs of a 3-story building poking out of the sediment that's been trapped within that dam. Now this got me really excited during my PhD. I was like, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. But after a couple of field seasons, I came back to my PhD office and I started having some real issues. The people I was working with weren't doing field work. There were a lot of people doing numerical modelling, remote sensing. People were sitting there and they were working and smashing out code and writing publications. And all I had after 2 years were a few bags of pebbles. And I really struggled with that. I was like, gosh, I shouldn't be here. I don't know what I'm doing. I just like to go out on a jolly in the field. And there were a few points where I actually really wanted to quit. I wanted to drop out. I was like, I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I'm best looking at culverts and parks. And somebody pointed out to me, it sounds like you have imposter syndrome. And this is something which has become like really well acknowledged in the UK now. I don't know, I haven't been here long enough to see, I don't know, speak to people who kind of have the same problem. And it's something I still have now. Basically, imposter syndrome is when you feel like you don't know anything about anything and everyone else around you is an expert in something. And there's this overwhelming feeling of, oh, I don't belong here. So I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to ask questions, because people are going to think I'm stupid. And that's definitely what I had at this point in my PhD. I wanted to drop out and become a paramedic at that point, I think. The obvious next progression. And how did I get through it? I think I've always been outnumbered by men in any labs I've been in. I've never had a female supervisor at any point in my career. I've always been in offices where I'm maybe one or maybe 2 women at best, in a group of maybe 10 to 15 people. And I hear a lot of stuff now where people are like, you need to have prominent female role models. And I was like, well, damn, I don't have any. But it turns out they don't need to be female. I had a fantastic team of supervisors who are all middle-aged men, basically. And I just went to one of them one day and I told him exactly what I just said and how I've been feeling. And they really helped me through it. And they are very proactive with me in terms of promoting what I do, encouraging me to try new things, to speak up for myself and stand up for my ideas. And also just provide a great environment. And the one thing that they reminded me to always do is to remember why you're doing what you're doing. And it all stems back to that initial love of landscapes, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So to cut a long story short, I got through the PhD. I had a video that I might put on I'm undecided. But what I just thought I'd finish with very quickly is just go through 3 things that I wish I'd known earlier in my research career. And the first one is that nobody is the wrong gender or too junior to give you guidance. I was really struggling mentally in a completely male-dominated environment, but actually some of those people gave me some of the best advice I've had. And if you are having trouble, just speak out. That's the only way you're going to get through it. It's not burying your head in the sand. The second thing is it's okay to not know something. I think I definitely started out at conferences and presentations being asked questions and not knowing the answer and thinking, crumbs, if I don't give a good answer, everyone's going to think I'm thick. But actually it's alright just to turn around and say, do you know what, I don't know, but great question. And then, finally, always remember why you are doing what you are doing. And if you can't remember, you probably shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And that's okay. So that's kind of my spin on the email that you sent me. But what I was going to do, I'm going to put this video on, which is actually, I was asked to make this video through a funding council that I did a short project for, that they wanted some kind of social media-y output. It makes me cringe every time I watch it and throw up in my mouth slightly. But I'm going to put it on and get a lot of stick for it later, I think. But this is actually what my research is. Do we have sound?
Let me just double check.
Ooh,
I'm not sure there's internet. I remember he asked me that.
Yeah, I think we're going. Yeah.
When rivers exit,
There we
they
go.
are often packed with sediment generated by erosion of the upstream landscape, and it's washed into the channel by rainstorms like these seen on screen now. Sediment deposition downstream of mountain ranges like the Himalaya can also cause the river channel to change course and increase flood risk. Our research tries to understand how and where these rivers deposit sediment as they leave the mountain range. We do this by taking physical measurements of the sediment and water in these channels during the high flow season, aka the monsoon. And to do this, we use a boat designed and built by Ed Tipper at the University of Cambridge. Hi, Ed. We start by identifying accessible locations where we can launch the boat, often providing entertainment to local villagers. We then use a piece of equipment called an acoustic Doppler current profiler mounted to a bodyboard to measure information on channel geometry, water discharge and velocity, and to select the point in the channel to collect sediment samples from later. To get to this point in the day can often take several hours. Once we've selected a point in the channel, we load the sampler onto the boat and try and return to that same point in the channel. We then lower the sampler to different depths in the water column and take a 5-metre sample. This allows us to measure the concentration and the grain sizes of sediment being carried in suspension and observe how this changes with depth and distance away from the mountains. We then borrow more of Ed's equipment to filter our water sample in the evening, so we can extract the sediment which we then take back to the lab. But sediment also rolls and shuffles along the riverbed. Mikhail designed some very high-tech equipment to try and sample this sediment too. Again, we mount the bed sampler onto the boat and lower it onto the bottom of the channel. When we feel it hit the bottom, we leave it there for a while and then hoist it up. Sometimes it's good to see that science doesn't always work smoothly. But we had some minor successes, hoisting up 20 kilograms of sand on one day and a big bag of pebbles at another site. Part of being a scientist is experimenting with new ways of sampling the river. And sometimes it's about just appreciating where you are. Trying to understand and observe large-scale processes in big rivers can be unpredictable, but sometimes it rewards you. None of this would be possible without the help from Ed and also other collaborations we've developed over the past couple of years of Practical Action and KXED. Hopefully these kinds of networks will help advance our understanding of how these phenomenal landscapes evolve, but also how we can translate and use this knowledge in a more practical sense. Thanks as always to our brilliant team, our drivers Tenzing and Splash, and our boating heroes Rajesh and Anish.
Any questions?
Are you going to continue working in the Netherlands? Or does your knowledge translate to other
Yeah.
river systems?
So I'm starting to work in the Andes now. But I think my finger is always cemented in the Himalayas. So it's like the iconic mountain range in the world. It's much easier to study in these big mountain ranges where these processes are just like at just such a different scale. Yeah. So I think hopefully keep working on those.
Anyone else? No? Yes? Were you the first person in your family to go to university?
My dad did an open university.
Okay. So I was the first person in my family, and I grew up in Gloucester, not too far from you.
Okay.
And I always think at times I didn't know how to navigate
Yeah,
university.
I didn't know what PhD was until I was 21.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, your dad's at Open University, and so that's more campus kind of.
Yeah, my sisters also went.
Okay.
Just before.
Did they try and help you then, or did you seek advice?
No, they encouraged us to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, all the speakers. The field trough is open.